Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, your podcast co-host and PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communication. This week, Governor Gavin Newsom released what they call the May Revise, which is the revised version of his January budget plan, taking into account how much tax revenue the state has collected, the latest economic forecasts, and other factors such as the President Trump global tariff plan and all the discussion going on in Washington, D.C., even as we speak, over the reconciliation plan and President Trump's one big beautiful bill proposal. And so, as always, you can count on PRI for the top free market analysis of the state budget, and this year is no different. So this week, we're pleased to have with us our Dr. Wayne Winegarden, who's a PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, and as I always say, the hardest working man at PRI. I don't know when he finds time in the day to do all of the things that he does. And on our discussion this week, we'll have a deep dive on all aspects of the governor's May Revise plan, and Wayne will share his thoughts on his proposals for closing the budget deficit, his level of spending, some of the more controversial proposals, such as governor's plan to expand health care to all undocumented in California, and then, of course, some of the other hot button issues like the governor's latest proposals on homelessness. So if you're interested in how Sacramento is spending your hard-earned tax dollars, stay tuned. You're going to get some good lessons, and you probably aren't going to like what you hear from all of us. So after the break, please enjoy Wayne Winegarden in conversation with Rowena Itchon and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Winegarden tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
Wayne, it's great to have you back as we do a deep dive into Governor Gavin Newsom's May Revise budget plan. Let's start with an overall question. You've argued in PRI's Spending Watch series that the governor should prepare the May Revise based on the premise that the state is in a weaker fiscal position than when the original budget was proposed in January. How realistic a foundation do you believe the governor's economic and fiscal assumptions are in the May Revise, and just how bad a shape are California's budget and economy in these days?
Thanks, Ro. It's so great to be back with you guys. I think, directly to answer your question, it's not a realistic foundation, and our budget and our economy are in really bad shape. And part of the reason why I say it's not realistic, one of the things he tried to do in his speech today on the May Revise was talk about how it's all President Trump's fault, that the Trump tariffs have caused a bad economy, and if it weren't for the bad economy, our budget would be fine. And giving him his credit, he's absolutely right. President Trump's tariffs are a complete disaster. It's a really dunderheaded idea, and it's hurting growth, and it's hurting the state tax revenues across the country. And that is 100% correct. But the problem with that is that when you look at California's economy, it's been flatlining since 2002, probably a good time period to pick. If you look at like our employment growth, we've been basically flat, no employment growth for almost over 2 years, whereas the continued employment growth in the overall U.S. economy. Look at output, total output. The governor talks about how our GDP growth in the last quarter was faster than the U.S. average. And for that one quarter, yes. But since Gavin Newsom's been governor, overall, the California economy has fallen behind compared to the U.S. economy. And so what this means for the budget is that our economy is in worse shape, our revenues are in worse shape. And so he's not taking into account the adverse impacts of his taxes and his regulations on our growth potential. And so, in fact, we're spending too much money. He's not recognizing that we have that spending problem. And so that we're going to actually continue to struggle with deficits because he's not being realistic about where the economy is going and kind of what he needs to do to balance the budget.
One of the things that the governor's talked about surrounding the May revise is his plan to revise the so-called GAN limit, which is a voter-approved measure from the 1970s on that limits state spending. It's been weakened over the years, and he wants to weaken it some more. And he also has another push to increase the amount of money that the state can save in the rainy day fund. Now, the rainy day fund, of course, was long a priority of fiscal conservatives, and saving more for future downturns doesn't sound like a bad idea. So why are you skeptical of the governor's approach here? Now, why should Californians, in your view, be wary of this proposal?
He should be wary because, like so much of what the governor does, he speaks very well and he makes things seem logical. But when you just kind of peel things back, you realize he's just completely off base. And so that's exactly when we talk about the rainy day fund, you talk about the GAN limit. He's just demonstrating he doesn't understand what's causing our budget crises. So let's start with the rainy day fund. He's saying we need to expand the rainy day fund because we have extreme revenue volatility, and therefore the rainy day fund will kind of help us smooth out that spending. And that would make sense if, in fact, kind of that revenue volatility was something that we had to deal with. But when you look at kind of studies that looked at state volatility, like at the Pew Trust, they did a study, and California's was the fifth most volatile, which is really bad. And it's even worse because all the states that are more volatile in California, they rely on what's called a severance tax, taxes on oil, coal, other minerals. And by definition, severance taxes are exceptionally volatile. So if you take out those states, talking about Alaska, Wyoming, California's is the most volatile revenue system. We're significantly more volatile than the rest of the country because of the progressivity of our tax system and how over-reliant we are on the stock market. That's a policy choice. So we don't need to expand the rainy day fund because that's actually, in this case, just trying to kind of compensate for our poor tax structure. And the bottom line is you can't. The poor tax structure needs to be addressed. And so that's the problem with that idea. Same thing with the GAN limit. The GAN limit's been weakened over time. It's supposed to create some sort of expenditure control, but we keep finding new ways to work around it. But it's still providing a bit of spending control. And his idea to move around is basically demonstrating that he doesn't understand that we're a high tax, high spending state, that they're at unaffordable levels, and that the spending is the problem. So compared to all the states, we spend about 13.4% of our personal income. That's the size of government. That's 25% higher than all others. And it's nearly 80% higher than a state like Florida. So the point being, we're a high tax, high spending state. We don't need to get rid of the GAN limit. We need more expenditure control, and we need to provide fiscal discipline on what the budget is really doing.
Governor Newsom is no exception to the long line of governors who criticize the state's volatile tax system as contributing to the state's short-term and long-term fiscal problems. In an op-ed on the May revise that will be published soon, he makes the case that tax reform can help address the problem in the long run, but a different approach will be needed in the short term. So share your thoughts on our listeners, Wayne.
Well, in terms of the long term, like we were just talking, that we have this revenue volatility problem, and that the rainy day fund isn't the solution to our volatility. What the solution is a flat tax, right? It's a tax that is going to have the broadest possible tax base with the lowest possible tax rate. And if you look at states like Florida or Texas, right, they don't have an income tax, so their system is flatter, and they have revenue volatility that's much closer to the national average. Virginia has essentially a flat income tax. it's progressive up to like the first $10,000 or $15,000 worth of income, and they have below average revenue volatility. So all these examples demonstrate that if you improve the working of your tax system, if you create a tax system that's more along that kind of neutral principle, having the lowest possible rate on the broadest possible base, that you're not only going to have fewer distortions, not only going to encourage more economic growth, but you're also going to diminish the amount of revenue volatility for the states that imply that. So if California did that, we would get a lot less revenue volatility. Now, and this is what I argue in the editorial. I mean, this is a long run reform. It's something that the legislature should do in this cycle. They won't. I'm not naive enough to think that they will, but they should. But that really won't address the current crisis. And so the way we have to address the current crisis is to recognize it as a spending problem, that we've spent way too much. And I think a great way of envisioning it is if it's a family that's maxed out their credit cards during good times and spends every last dime so they don't save anything, then when volatility happens, which it does in life, you're in a really bad position. And that's the exact place that California has put itself. And so what we need to do now, the only sensible thing to do is to have that fiscal discipline that's been missing. And because we've been spending money so poorly, there's a lot of opportunities to control spending while still kind of serving those essential functions that Californians expect from the government.
So in the run-up to the release of the May Revised, the governor made this big announcement on homelessness, and he announced some new spending on local homeless programs around the state, and he also released a new model ordinance for cities to adopt to enforce the no camping laws. So what are your thoughts on the governor's announcement and then his other homeless funding priorities that he laid out in the May Revise?
Well, in terms of the announcement, I think that's welcome news that, we do need to remove the homeless encampments. The homeless encampments they're bad for the homeless, they're bad for the community, they're bad for local businesses, and they're quite frankly, they're inhumane. I mean, that's not the way a state as wealthy as California should be dealing with the issue. And so he's 100% correct. And I'm really glad to see him pushing that and this idea that it's not cruel to remove the encampments. It's actually it's cruel to let those fester as we've been doing. In terms of addressing the problem, I think that's where I would part ways with the governor and be concerned, because he continues to rely on the housing first approach to policy, and we've talked about this many times in the past. And the problem with his approach to homelessness is that he focuses on the dollar amount of spending as if that expenditure itself is an accomplishment. So $24 billion since 2019. And he uses stats like that to show how much he's done for the problem. And of course, the issue is homelessness has only gotten worse as we've spent the $24 billion. And so most people, I think, would call that a waste, not a good thing. The fact that we've spent $24 billion and the problem has only worsened is actually something to be ashamed of, because we haven't changed our approach, right? Which is, the definition of insanity. That's what we keep doing. So what we need to do is just jettison this idea of housing first and take on the idea that what we want to do is find temporary housing solutions, find institutional solutions, leverage homelessness courts to help get people who are suffering from mental illness or addiction off of the street and into the treatment that they need. And there's all sorts of evidence from private organizations that we can, leveraging these ideas, that we can address the issue of homelessness, help those who are homeless, and do it all for significantly less than what we're currently spending. It requires a change in policy approach, though, and in doing that, we could actually again save money and address the problem.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Wayne, one of the things that you criticize the Newsom administration for is ignoring the opportunity for government oversight and doubling down spending on programs that aren't working while failing to seize the opportunity for billions in budget savings on things that aren't working. And this year's May revise is no exception. Give us a few examples of this trend.
I think the global climate change spending is a perfect example, because we're spending billions of dollars on alternative energy infrastructure, right? Solar panels, wind farms, offshore wind. We have all our energy transition programs, EV charging stations. We're still funding the ever delayed, always over budget high-speed rail that really isn't going anywhere, but we'll continue to dump billions of dollars into that. We're going to subsidize rich people so they can purchase electric vehicles, even though people, working class people, low-income Californians can't afford the gas because of the policies we do that jacks up the price. So, all of that spending, again, we're talking about the problem of global climate change, and we're measuring our success based on how much we're spending, not actually what the impact is. And so if you actually go to the Energy Information Administration, they collect data on state greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide emissions. And I think what's really fascinating is if you go back to 2012, which is when we really started most of these programs, including the cap and trade program that we're running, California's emissions are down 6.2%. In other words, our emissions as of 2022, that's the latest data, is 6.2% lower than 2012. And that sounds impressive, but the average for the U.S. is down 5.4%. And so we're actually very close to the national average, and which much smaller than states like West Virginia, who've seen a 14% decline. And that decline actually is mostly driven by natural gas. So there's a lot of policies out there that can help us reduce our emissions. For instance, embracing a lot of the improvements in nuclear energy, not shutting down our last nuclear power plant, and using the latest technology to build nuclear capacity, which is 0% of emissions, that we actually know provides reliable, cheap power. Same thing with natural gas. It actually reduces overall emissions compared to our current infrastructure. It does it reliably. It does it cheaply. So, we promote that affordability. So there's all sorts of programs that we could be doing that would actually help reduce our emissions. And most importantly, in terms of the May revise, in that context, we could save money. Stop spending money on charging stations that nobody is going to use and that are always broken. And instead, put those resources where they actually make a difference.
So, Wayne, the May revise was crafted and was released today at the same time that the details of President Trump's so-called one big, beautiful bill are being released, and all the committee hearings are going on in Congress to finalize the House proposal. Now, many of the provisions of the reconciliation bill, some of which we don't know yet, will have an impact on budget writers in Sacramento. So let's start with Governor Newsom's proposal to expand eligibility for the undocumented who are able-bodied and working age. This proposal has already affected this year's state budget, and now the reconciliation bill threatens to make this budget problem worse. So talk about this issue and also Governor Newsom's announced proposal on the issue.
Governor Newsom, he has, I think, some sort of recognition that the expansion of Medi-Cal is unaffordable, right? Because part of his solution is he's saying we're going to restrict the growth of the program. And to that extent, that it's good that he's restricting the growth, but that's certainly inadequate and certainly not up to the moment. We're talking about $10 billion are some of the estimates of how much the expanded eligibility is costing the state. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. When you talk about the expansion to undocumented, able-bodied, working age people, it's it's another $3 billion. And this is not about immigration. I think that's really important. Milton Friedman used to always talk about the fact that you can't have a kind of immigration and a huge welfare state, because inevitably they're going to clash. And so we need immigrants, we need kind of that migration, but you can't offer kind of these benefits and certainly put that cost on the California taxpayer and to some extent the American taxpayer to fund that. And so I think there's a theoretical, I mentioned that because I think there's a really important kind of foundational issue that's the point. But the practical issue is that it's just not something that's affordable. The program is meant to be a safety net for low income mothers or children, disabled, elderly. I mean, it's a safety net program. The fact that right now we have almost a third of Californians on Medi-Cal is an indication that the program has completely gone off its rails. And so expanding it is just the absolute kind of fiscally irresponsible approach. Now, of course, there's, as a reconciliation process, and you mentioned this, Tim, that, that's going on in DC, and there's going to be certain issues that they're discussing, certain changes, policy changes that will affect California. One of the issues that they're discussing is reducing the portion of federal money that goes to California by around 10% is the numbers they're talking about now, because Medi-Cal is spending its money on undocumented immigrants. And that is obviously all those impacts. If they change Medicaid at the federal level, that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And that's going to put more costs on the Medi-Cal program, is something that the legislature may need to deal with. But one, responding to something that doesn't exist means we're just negotiating with ourselves. Two, we need to bring that program into line. We need to get some sort of control over this program, and we need to start getting the incentives right so that people aren't using Medicaid, which is lousy insurance, as its primary form of insurance. It's meant to be a safety net that puts people back into the private insurance market once they get back on their feet. So we've got all of those kind of issues that are going on that we need to manage. But I think the most important thing is we need to get financial and fiscal control over the Medi-Cal program. And the expansion to the undocumented is just a very obvious area where we could actually help bring the program so we can safeguard it for those who need it, the program's intentions, without spending too much money. And quite frankly, while we're doing this, we need to look at the ACA expansion of Medicaid. And I know 90% of the money may come from the federal government, 10% still coming from California. And Medicaid was never meant to be a program for people who are men in their 20s who are working. I mean, that's not what Medicaid is for. And so we really need to take a hard look. Again, when you're dealing with the fiscal position that we're dealing with, you just can't abide by these types of just unaffordable kind of encroachments of these policies, of these programs.
Another issue that is a big focus of both the Newsom May revise and the reconciliation bill being discussed in Congress is green subsidies and green spending. Though Newsom and Republicans in Washington have quite different priorities here. Talk about what's being discussed in Washington and how it too could negatively impact California's budget picture.
Well, before we go into the budget picture, and that's really important, one I guess shout out I think would actually benefit California, even though the policymakers wouldn't admit it, is that they're talking about ending California's ability to phase out gas-powered cars. And Congress is looking at that in part because we would in California be setting the national transportation policy across all the states simply because of our size and the size of the other states that are jumping on. And that really is not the place for California to be setting national policy. Just like Californians wouldn't be happy if Texans were setting kind of our environmental policies here, the reverse holds true. And so if to the extent that Congress does in fact move forward with that and takes away our ability to phase out gas-powered cars, it's the right thing to do from a fiscal federalism perspective. From a California perspective, it would actually be saving ourselves from ourselves. And so that would be a wonderful policy. Not necessarily a budget issue, but certainly I think something worth worth mentioning. Something that will impact our budget is Congress is talking about rescinding spending on alternative energy projects. They're talking about rescinding spending on the bullet train that we had talked about earlier. And so that will impact our budget. And if California is going to want to continue to go forward with the bullet train, very likely we're going to have to find the funds that the federal government is currently providing. But right now, if you look at the bullet train, we're just throwing good money after bad. And we've been saying that for years, but it continues to be true. And so hopefully, if we look at this positively, by the federal government being fiscally responsible, perhaps that will somehow force California to stop implementing these policies. And it's not just the bullet train. It's the same thing with EV charging stations. These are, it's a terrible investment. And most people who are trying to use these public charging stations would tell you half the time they're not working. They're just inconvenient, but also a majority of people don't have electric vehicles. And despite the mandates, a majority aren't going to have them anytime in the near future. And all we're doing is wasting money, on programs that benefit a niche population, that benefit kind of special interests in Sacramento, but are burdening the overall state with incredible costs that we can't afford. So again, I think we can look at some of that spending discipline coming out of Congress as an opportunity that perhaps it will force us to do the right policy and stop wasting money and throwing good money after bad on projects that just aren't sustainable.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So a running theme in budget discussions both in Sacramento and in Washington is taxes. And one issue that would have a big impact on Californians is this really intense debate in Washington right now over the federal, state, and local tax deduction. Members of Congress from high-tax, high-spending states like California and New York are trying to increase the SALT cap. So what are your thoughts on this proposal and, how might the resolution impact the state budget?
Living in a high-tax state, we all potentially benefit from lifting the SALT cap. But the problem is that it's just the wrong policy. The SALT cap has really two perverse effects, which is why you shouldn't have a SALT deduction at all, right? First of all, when you have the state and local tax deduction off of your federal taxes, what we're doing is we're subsidizing the cost of high tax states, right? California, the tax burden of people paying taxes in California is going to be 20-30% lower than what it would otherwise be, because you get to deduct your state and local tax that you paid off of the federal taxes. And so you get that deduction. Economic incentives being what they are, right? The more you subsidize something, the more of that good or service you're going to get. So in case of the SALT deduction, right, the more we subsidize California spending, the more government spending that we're going to get. And so a lot of the things we've been talking about today have to some extent, not the only contributor, obviously, but it is a marginal contributor, is that the SALT cap allows the state to get larger than it should be. And so that's a negative consequence from it, that we end up with a larger state government, than we would otherwise because of the SALT cap. And so without that deduction, the size of the government would be smaller than it is. The second impact, and this is what I think people in Congress focus on a great deal, is that it also hurts residents who live in other states, because it's not as if the federal government is reducing its spending in response to the reduced tax revenues from the high tax states. So instead, spending is what it would otherwise be. So the federal government's either imposing higher taxes on everyone, or it's running a larger budget deficit, which ultimately gets financed by everyone. So either way, the costs from the from kind of the federal taxes on everyone else are going to be higher because the taxes paid by residents of California, New York, and New Jersey, other high tax states, are being lower. And so that is going to have that distributive implications. And, it makes sense that residents of other low tax states are going to resent this, especially, I guess partly benefit because they don't realize it's going on, but if they do realize they're realizing that they're actually paying higher taxes because we're paying lower taxes because our state spends so much. In other words, people in low tax states are subsidizing people in high tax states, and that's just not the way it should be. If Californians want to have a high tax, high spending state, which hopefully they don't, but if they do, then we should be the ones who pay the cost.
So given the liberal makeup of the legislature, one might expect that there would be a big push for new taxes in the May revise and in the final weeks before the state's June 15th budget deadline. You've written about how introducing new or higher taxes to close this year's budget deficit would cause a lot of problems for the state's economy. So share your thoughts with our listeners. What's your view of the role of tax increases and how they could play in the final state budget and outcome?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic. I'm going to be hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. I mean, I think we're already seeing from those on the left side of the aisle that while we look at this and are disappointed in the fiscal discipline that the governor is exhibiting, they look at it and say, oh my God, there's too much fiscal discipline. Why aren't we raising taxes? Why aren't we closing loopholes? All sorts of very disappointing responses. But, we're already seeing that pressure. And there's a $12 billion shortfall that has to be closed. And the gimmicks and the games that are in the May revise, that shows the governor's not really serious about fiscal discipline as he needs to be. But two, it's showing that there's all of this pressure and they're really not willing to make the cuts that they need to. And we haven't even factored in what we were just talking about Congress reducing its spending in the state, which will cause higher costs on the state government, on the California. So because we're not talking about cutting staff, we're not eliminating open positions, we're not kind of doing all of these just very sensible policies that would impose discipline. Tax increases are going to be the politically expedient answer. It's what I'm afraid of. It's going to be the economically destructive one. And we talked about earlier how employment is flatlining and GDP growth is smaller than the national average. But it feels that the pressure is going to mount, and as the Congress moves on their bill and the budget becomes even tighter in the future, that they may turn to it. I hope they don't, but they may. And if they do, it's really going to have a deleterious impact on kind of the economy, on our welfare. But ironically, what it will also do is depress tax revenue growth in the future and just ensure that we continue to have budget issues for the next several years.
So let's end our discussion today with an update on an issue that you've been writing about extensively this year, and it was a major focus of Governor Newsom's budget announcement today, and that's President Trump's tariff plan. We've seen some announcements recently with the UK and China on agreeing to talk more and work toward a final deal. But no overall trade deals have really been announced yet. And we saw Governor Newsom today talking about how he blames, what he calls the Trump slump, largely, which includes tariffs, for losing about $16 billion of revenue for the state. So what's the latest on the Trump tariffs, and how does the continued threat of tariffs, in your view, stand to complicate efforts of states like California to close their budget deficits this year?
Yeah, I mean, the tariffs are a really bad policy. If you look at the Reagan formula for growth, right, and it is still just as relevant today as it was in 1980 when he was running for office. It was fiscal discipline, like we've been talking about, lower, flatter taxes on a broader base, deregulation, right, and free trade, right? Those were just throwing sound money, but that's really not relevant to our discussion. Those were the planks of the Reagan Revolution, and those are the policies that will help us today kind of get out of our economic funk and really start getting broad-based, robust growth. And so the fact that we take away all the volatility, because it's hard to kind of keep track of things. But where we sit right now is before Trump took office, the average tariff rate was around 2.5%. 2.5%. Now the minimum rate is 10%. We've got a 30% rate on China, and there's other higher rates that are on specific products. So what we've seen then is a significant increase in costs. We have a significant increase in cost for consumers, and we have a significant increase in the cost of production for manufacturers and service organizations that are importing products and or things they need to produce their goods and services. That means that we have now higher impact on prices, which is going to harm kind of affordability. And we also have kind of a disincentive for growth. We have a disincentive for producing things efficiently. And all of this is detrimental to economic growth, and especially to broad-based growth. When you have policies like this that start picking winners and losers, then what ends up happening is the system becomes much more cronyist and much less free market. And we've been kind of sliding that way for a while. And the tariffs really open up kind of that opportunity for really special interests to promote themselves over the common interest. So there's so many different ways that the tariffs are making things worse, and especially because the whole concept that trade deficits are a sign that we're being ripped off is just complete nonsense. So all of that is pessimistic. And so to end a little bit more optimistically, we have seen kind of a rollback on the tariffs, and so ideally, we have the 90-day pause on all countries except China. China's tariffs, again, like I said, are back down to 30%. And so maybe we'll continue to see progress. And to the extent that we do, we're minimizing the damage. And ideally, if we could get back down to that average 2.5% rate or even lower, we could end up in a better spot. And so that's the hope. I'm not sure that's realistic. But right now, I think we would be naive for us not to recognize that there's this continued threat from tariffs. It complicates efforts for states, it complicates the economy, and it's just decidedly anti-growth.
Thanks very much, Wayne.
Oh, thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.